It's been 1 year since the 2023 New Zealand election, in which the National Party was able to form a coalition government, 6 years after being kicked off the government benches last time they were in power. I thought it would be a good opportunity to have a look at the last year, see what policies the government has put in place, see what their priorities have been, and what we can classify as their achievements. A big part of their focus has been on education, so I thought I could take the government back to school and give Prime Minister Christopher Luxon his 1-year report card. So on election night, the 14th of October 2023, we got these numbers for the seats in Parliament. With no party receiving an outright majority, it was for the parties to discuss how they would form a working agreement or a coalition to form a government. There was technically a few options that could lead to a coalition, but we all knew what the real outcome would be. The centre-left National Party, led by former Air New Zealand CEO Christopher Luxon, would have to form a coalition with the further-right libertarian-esque ACT Party, and the right-wing populist party New Zealand First, led by political juggernaut Winston Peters. I've made pretty big videos on both of these parties if you want more details on their policies and their positions. But know that the leaders of these two parties were bold political beasts, who had very bold policies for this country that may or may not align with each other.
There are adults in the room. Can I just say that $38 billion in cuts would be a massive depression in this country.
David Seymour, who do you reckon would win a fight between you and Winston Peters?
Oh, look, I wouldn't fight him like that. It'd be elder abuse. But all I would say is he thinks he's going to break me. The only thing he's ever broken is promises.
Are you and David Seymour going to work together? You're both from up north. You're both Māori. I mean, how does that all work?
Oh, for goodness sake, David Seymour discovered his Maoriness the same way Columbus discovered America. Purely by accident.
Could you work with Winston?
Look, I think actually the question is, can anyone? Nobody's been able to. It's not credible for the guy who's had more chances to fix New Zealand's problems than anyone else alive.
Hang on.
Here
we go again.
Rebecca, I'm sorry.
It's
like an arsonist showing up dressed as a fireman saying, I'm here to help and fix it all for you.
Do people actually trust that Luxon is going to be able to manage these two? Like, for real?
But one thing is for sure, all of the voters for these three parties were opposed to the previous Labour government and wanted to push for a new vision for New Zealand. So negotiations took place to form a coalition, and then they kept going, and then they kept going. We famously have had very long government negotiations in the past, but most people kind of assumed that these three right-wing parties, who were all on the same page that this was the only feasible government structure, would nail out a deal quickly. Yet, it wasn't until the 24th of November till we finally had an agreement.
Christopher Luxon spent his Labour Day weekend fishing, but it seems he didn't have much luck catching anything, at least not according to his social media. A bit like National's coalition negotiations with ACT and New Zealand First, where the public is yet to catch how a potential deal is shaping up.
How are the negotiations going?
Oh, look, we've made great progress, but this week's an important one. We've got issues to close out with both parties.
Despite the National and ACT leaders waiting patiently in the capital, Winston Peters was nowhere to be found.
Leaving it to his poetic deputy.
At the appointed hour, the man will arrive.
What's the appointed hour?
Pardon? No, we'll just have to tie-ho. Don't. Is it worth us? Work is happening despite the physical absence at the moment.
That work will continue this week, hopefully quickly.
Positive. That's how coalition talks were described today as Christopher Luxon finally got around a table with New Zealand First Winston Peters and ACT's David Seymour.
The clock is ticking for Christopher Luxon if he wants to make it to APEC, a huge regional trade meeting this week. He has just 2 days to strike a deal with ACT and New Zealand First. Otherwise, Labour has told Breakfast they'll go instead.
Christopher Luxon has previously talked up his speedy negotiating skills and his desire for a quick deal.
It's unlikely I'll head out to APEC on Wednesday evening.
So we're getting close? Yeah, we're getting there.
Look, my sense is that we are in the final stages.
We're pretty close, and for us it's about just working through our last couple of issues and conversations that we want to have.
It's 34 days since the election, 14 since special votes came back, 2 since the recounts. As talks drag on,
I've just literally run out of clothes, so I've got to go home. This is Christopher Luxon's shirt. I borrowed it from him.
All I want is a good government for New Zealand. I want agreements signed so we can get on and govern.
Deputy Prime Minister, is that one of the big issues?
It's fair to say it is one of the ones.
I kind of wonder what's taking them so long.
This was over a month after Election Day. In the meantime, the All Blacks lost the Rugby World Cup final. Frankly, the first strike against Christopher Luxon's government. But finally, we had a coalition agreement, outlining the policy promises that National made to keep their coalition partners happy. There were also agreements on how to share ministerial power. Each minor party got to get 3 cabinet minister portfolios, with both David Seymour and Winston Peters sharing the deputy prime minister role. This is a pretty hilarious agreement. In the past, the leader of the second largest party in the coalition would become the deputy prime minister, basically a ceremonial role with no real power. But it seemed that Winston Peters had got his back up and refused to let the ACT Party leader, David Seymour, get one over top of him, even though the ACT Party was a larger party with a larger share of the vote. Anyway, there it is. We have a government, we have a cabinet, and we have a document that agrees on the government's goals for the next 3 years. Now between us, there are far too many people here to discuss, so let's break this cabinet down to a workable org chart and focus on the important characters. So let's discuss the last year, the policies, the controversies, and the ministers themselves. It's very hard to discuss the work of government chronologically, as everything is happening at the same time and can take months to progress. So I'll be jumping around throughout the year a bit. I hope you can keep up. So let's start with the Finance Minister and Christopher Luxon's right-hand woman, Nicola Willis. National's figurehead policy for the 2023 election was tax cuts. Inflation and rising prices have been affecting everyone, and National promised the first tax cuts that Kiwis would be getting in over a decade. The big number that they were spouting before the campaign was $250,000 a fortnight for an average family.
For an average household income family with young kids, that would mean $250 a fortnight. An average household income family with young kids gets $250 a fortnight. Is that an additional $250 a fortnight, $250 extra a fortnight? An average household income family in New Zealand would get $250 a fortnight if they had young kids.
Now, I'm not sure if you spotted the weasel word pronunciation, but it is not saying that the average tax cut would be $250 a fortnight. It is saying that if you look at the components of their tax cut plan and say that an average family could technically exist that would receive all of it, then that would be the average family that would get that level of tax cuts. So how many families would actually be getting that $250?
To be clear, how many families will get that much?
Just under 3,000.
Just under 3,000.
But when it all came down to it, this was the tax cuts.
On average, a family with children will be better off $78 a fortnight. On average, an individual New Zealander will be better off $32 a fortnight.
I guess it helped alleviate some struggles, but it certainly wasn't the big windfall that some Kiwis were expecting. It's kind of embarrassing that they campaigned on such a misleading statement of $250, and it's crazy that they think it's okay to misrepresent their policies like this. But what's crazier is the actual massive tax cuts that National has given, but not to everyday people, but to landlords. The last government changed a tax law to disallow property investors to deduct the interest of their mortgages from their tax bill. In simple terms, it was a tax loophole that allowed investors to decrease their tax bill. In a property market that is out of control, with investors owning more and more of a share of the market and first-home buyers finding it impossible to get on the ladder, this move was to decrease speculation and cool the housing prices. But I guess Christopher Luxon said, not on my watch. They brought back this interest deductibility option. Additionally, they changed the qualification year for the Brightline test, our pseudo capital gains tax, for selling a property within 10 years to 2 years. Both of these policies giving billions of dollars of tax cuts to investors and landlords, at the same time that the National Party cut a Labour policy for first-home buyer grants.
The Kiwi dream just got further out of reach for first home buyers, the government confirming it's scrapping the first home grant, effective immediately.
The housing grants were up to $5,000 per buyer for an existing home or $10,000 for a new build, so a couple could have been eligible for up to $20,000 for their deposit. National never campaigned on scrapping the grants and in fact pushed for an increase to the price caps last term so more first home buyers could access it. Its press release saying Labour was leaving first home buyers out in the cold.
Yeah, well, that was then, this is now, and we've just had to confront the fiscal conditions that we are in.
Fronting the fiscals by freezing out first home buyers.
The injustice of finding $2.9 billion to reverse the interest deductibility changes, aka the landlord tax cut, while taking this from first home buyers, won't be lost on those who are scraping together every penny they can toward a house deposit while they're paying sky-high rent, sky-high grocery bills and a double whammy cost of living and housing crisis. National was elected on a promise to help the squeezed middle, but some of that squeezed middle will feel like they've done the complete opposite.
It's pretty easy to see whose side of the housing market the National Party represents. While we're talking about housing, I think it's a good opportunity to discuss the landlord-in-chief himself, Christopher Luxon. It's been a bit of a controversy on how rich the Prime Minister actually is. The former CEO of Air New Zealand, being a multi-millionaire, who owns 7 odd properties, doesn't really make him off to be their everyman. And when his priorities are bringing in tax cuts, specifically tax cuts for landlords, it's hard to see how he isn't just lining his own pockets. Especially after recently he just sold 2 of his properties right after the government changed the Bright Line test rules, where he would have paid tax on the capital gains that those properties had made under the old rules. Why is the government's priorities on giving tax cuts to people like Christopher Luxon, multi-millionaires? Additionally, Christopher Luxon personally owns a house in Wellington and his electoral office, in which he rents both of them to the taxpayer. It's crazy that we allow MPs to decide what properties that they wish to rent for government purposes, and we allow them to rent their own personal properties to enrich themselves. It's absolutely bonkers. Christopher Luxon is the master of using government perks to enrich himself, all while discussing austerity and how the government needs to spend less. Education policy is a big focus point for this government. There have been some shocking claims about the educational pass rate in New Zealand, and this government's plan is to bring in more focus on core subjects like math and English. Inherently, that sounds promising. I'm no expert on educational policy, and honestly I wouldn't know the first thing about bringing up these achievement numbers. However, it seems that their plans are being rushed through with little consideration regarding what is the right move. It seems that they are looking for a quick fix, something that they can point to at the next election and say, hey look, the numbers went up, that's because of us. Frankly, the teaching of math and English, and so on, shouldn't be a partisan issue, and I'm not sure why it's becoming so. We all agree that kids need to get a good education, and we probably just all need to sit down and come together and work out the way forward. Another big part of the government's plan for schools is a blanket phone ban policy. This is one of those things that sounds good on the campaign trail, but it just seems to be not that useful. Schools already have phone bans. I remember when I was in high school during the John Key years, and we obviously weren't allowed to use phones during class. This blanket rule is however saying that there is no legitimate reason to have a phone in class ever? Surely there are good reasons to use them. For emergencies, and to use them as a class resource seem to be a good reason off the top of my head. It seems to be another quick fix, like many national policies, opposed to letting schools make their own rules and policies around phone usage. Now the big policy pushed by Associate Education Minister David Seymour is charter schools.
Publicly funded, privately run charter schools are on their way back, big time. The government will pour $153 million into setting up 50 charter schools over the next 4 years. 15 schools will be brand new and 35 state schools will be converted. So what makes charter schools different? Well, they're run by private businesses, not-for-profits, churches or iwi, and are contracted by the state for 10 years. They don't have to teach the curriculum, but there will be targets for attendance and achievement, or they could be shut down. Associate Education Minister David Seymour says the schools provide more options for students.
Putting it simply, a charter school is essentially a private school that is paid for with taxpayer money. The argument is that allowing these schools to operate independently, you use the free market to encourage competition, and it leads to better outcomes for public education with the same money spent. I hate this policy. The idea that we're going to take public education, a right and a bedrock of the youth of this country, and make it a profit-seeking business is disgusting. The ACT Party is ideologically driven to take our tax dollars and funnel it into the pockets of private investment, all at the detriment of students and teachers. I mention teachers because both major teacher unions oppose this policy. Charter schools will make it harder for teachers to negotiate pay rises and push for union-led changes in education policy. The ACT Party loves to shit on teachers' unions, yet they're a compromise of the teachers of New Zealand, some of the most amazing people in the country, who take trash salaries, who do one of the most important jobs in this country. When it comes to education policies, I tend to side with teachers over former Fraser Institute libertarians like David Seymour. These charter schools do not need to teach the curriculum or even hire qualified teachers.
As well as hiring who they wish, charter schools will be able to teach what they wish and when they wish, but will have to meet attendance and achievement targets. Meanwhile, state schools are facing more handcuffs, like an hour of reading, writing and maths, and mandating structured literacy and the cell phone ban.
I absolutely think it's ironic. This is actually really crazy when you think about this, that you're putting this one set of rules in because you say this is what's most needed and this is going to make the biggest difference for our young people. But then on the other hand, you're saying let's open a bunch of schools where they don't have to follow these rules.
How can the government moan about the achievement rates of public schools while introducing this disaster of a policy which will use New Zealand's children as guinea pigs for a free market solution to education that will line the pockets of investors whose main focus is profit seeking? It's obviously a no-brainer that if charter schools are seeking profit with the same money going into them, it would lead to less money being spent on education, as part of the money will be given to the investors of the school.
And you guarantee that charter school students on average won't get more than state school students?
Oh, absolutely. Look, the principle here is that a child attending a charter school is funded no more or no less than a child in a similar state school.
We had charter schools in New Zealand in the last National and Act government, and getting rid of them was one of the best things that the last government did.
We were very clear from the outset that we believe in a quality public education system. We don't agree with the charter school model.
So if you saw some merit in some of these charter schools, why fix it?
Well, the issue is that we didn't agree with the charter school model. The charter school model is effectively a privatised, deregulated form of schooling. The opposition that we've got is to a privatised and deregulated form of schooling where kids can show up in schools that can be closed at the drop of a hat, that don't have registered qualified teachers. If you look at one of the schools, for example, that I haven't been able to make a decision on, it's because they're in leased premises and the lease is about to expire in the middle of a school year. So those kids could end up, even before this government made any decisions about that, with nowhere to go to school. That's not the type of education system that I want to operate.
This should be a line in the sand. Labour, the Greens and Te Pāti Māori need to all come out right now that charter schools will be abolished on their next government, and the people investing them will make a massive loss on their investments. Also, the government is intentionally signing long contracts for these new charter schools to make it harder for the next government to get rid of them. This is anti-democratic. The government should not be intentionally binding future governments to policies like this, and the Labour Party needs to come out right now and say those contracts will be broken on day one of any future Labour government. Further focus for the Associate Education Minister, David Seymour, is free school lunches. The government is cutting $107 million a year from the school lunch budget. According to Seymour, they will provide the same, if not better services by switching providers and using economies of scale to save money and still provide the same service. Paint me is not believing him. David Seymour ranted previously about woke food being served to kids, which is just odd behaviour.
According to the ACT Party, will be fruit and sandwiches, not woke food like quinoa and sushi. Can you please explain how sushi is woke?
Oh, look, if you don't get that sushi's woke, I don't know how to wake you up.
I didn't know that serving healthy food to kids was woke. Who knew? I'm calling it now that this program has been underfunded and the services will drop in quality. And small government smartasses like David Seymour will say, this is what happens when the government provides services like this. Let the free market feed the kids. And it will be used as an excuse to cut the program. And it's all because David Seymour is cutting $100 million from it. While we're talking about ACT's David Seymour, let's discuss his loudest and most controversial policy for this new government, the Treaty Principles Bill. David Seymour has been hell-bent on having a referendum to discuss and redefine the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi, and discuss what place the treaty has in New Zealand. Now, what does that mean, you might be asking? So the Treaty of Waitangi, the founding document of this country, was an agreement between the indigenous Māori and the Crown to establish the settlement and eventual creation of the country of New Zealand. Now, being a contract between two peoples in two different languages, there was a disagreement on what is and isn't part of the treaty. This is why the Waitangi Tribunal was created in the 70s, to allow lawyers and judges to hammer out the details. They devised what is called the Treaty Principles, essentially the understanding and interpretation of the Treaty of Waitangi. Now, people like David Seymour say, hold up, I didn't vote for this. I don't want the country to consider your ethnicity or culture when passing laws and carrying out policy. He says, let's have a vote on what the treaty actually means so that Kiwis can have a say. That sounds great in theory, right? Democracy in action. And while we're at it, let's have a vote on the stipulations on the contract that David Seymour signed to buy his house and retroactively change the parameters that he agreed to. That sounds insane, right? Well, it is. I don't know what world David Seymour lives in, but when it comes to interpreting legal contracts and treaties, that should be left to lawyers and judges, right? Not your average Joe Bob that couldn't even tell you what year the treaty was signed. The average person does not have the expertise to vote on how to interpret a contract that was signed 200 years ago. What this actually is a racist way to whip up anti-Māori sentiment when we could be doing better things with our time. Now, other than the fact that this is a completely racist policy intended to sow division within our country, it is a huge waste of time and money. The ACT Party moaned about this policy before the election and said it would be a deal breaker to form a coalition, while National and New Zealand First boasted that they wouldn't support it. When New Zealand First won't even support your racist bill, you know you're off the deep end.
Bring in half the refugees who are carrying HIV and all sorts of third world diseases. We can't help a New Zealander, but we can help every Tom, Dick and Harry, Mushtaq and Bin Laden. As they say in Beijing, two wrongs don't make a right.
Call out Shane Jones for what's being described as racist comments. The Cabinet Minister and New Zealand First MP said Indian students have ruined academic institutions and there were too many immigrants from New Delhi.
Well, David Seymour put his foot down and said he wants it passed. So in the coalition deal, all three parties promised to vote for the bill in the first reading, but have promised to vote it down come the second reading. So let me get this straight. We're going to waste hours and hours of parliamentary time dedicated to a bill that the very government is intending not to pass? This is estimated to cost $4 million worth of parliament time. I thought the ACT Party was all for saving taxpayers' money, but yet they are happy to waste $4 million for a doomed racist vanity project that won't pass. It's actually embarrassing. I want the ACT Party and their millionaire donors to reimburse the taxpayer for this wasted money. Health policy is a big issue, and we are already seeing controversial funding being pulled from New Zealand hospitals. However, I think the main change to health policy so far has been the change to prescription drugs and the funding of cancer drugs. So let's go back a few years. Public healthcare is heavily subsidised in New Zealand, with many of it being free to Kiwis. You used to have to pay a $5 copay for every prescription that you received, with the rest of it being funded by the taxpayer. However, in 2023, the Labour government said that they were going to be scrapping the copay prescription charge. They said that studies showed in the 2021 to 2022 financial year, 135,000 people did not pick up their medicine because they couldn't afford the cost. When you think about it, $5 isn't a lot of money, but if you're unwell and have multiple prescriptions, or are on long-term medication, you can see how this money can add up, especially for the poor and the elderly. This was a great move in my opinion. An unintended problem was noticed, and the government stepped in and solved the problem. However, National said not on my watch, and campaigned on bringing back the prescription fees. They said that the millions of dollars being spent on this could instead be given to Firearm, the government organisation who negotiates and buys drugs on behalf of the health service, and that money could be spent to fund currently unfunded cancer medication.
National will invest $280 million over 4 years to fund the 13 cancer treatments the New Zealand Cancer Control Agency says provide substantial clinical benefit that are funded in Australia but not here in New Zealand.
They'll fund it by scrapping the universal free prescriptions policy, saving $619 million over 4 years.
I'm all for funding healthcare, but it seems like a pretty weird one-for-one, robbing Peter to pay Paul, putting poor sick people against cancer patients.
It's another smoke and mirrors policy from the National Party. They want to take medicine off one group of New Zealanders in order to give it to another group of New Zealanders.
But when the first budget came out, only the prescription fees were brought back, but the new cancer drugs were not funded. Now let's be clear, they campaigned on the money for prescription drugs to be specifically linked to the funding of these cancer drugs. These policies were sold to voters as interlinked.
You know, this is your policy right here, and it's fully funded. You've got all of the technical names of all these different therapies and treatments, and it starts in budget year 2024-2025. Did you just rush this out without realising you could deliver it last year?
No.
However, the government came to a bit of a hurdle. So it turned out, Pharmac, being an independent body who has government autonomy, was not prepared to buy these cancer drugs that National had promised to the voters. Pharmac does what they can to fund the best variety of drugs with the budget that they have. And those promised cancer drugs were not up next on the list of drugs that Pharmac wished to fund if they were given more money. So National eventually funded 57 new medication. Only 26 were the promised cancer drugs. This is because they were forced to fund all the drugs above the cancer drugs on the wish list before they could fund their promised cancer drugs.
Because Pharmac's independent from politicians, the government cannot specify which treatments it should fund. Pharmac has a wait list of drugs it wants to fund. It's ranked, but the rankings are secret for commercial reasons. So to fund the specific drugs the government wants to, it needed to give Pharmac enough money to fund all the drugs ranked ahead of the 13 promised.
Now, I'm all for extra funding for Pharmac. This is a great thing and will lead to better health options for Kiwis. However, this is not what the National Party ran on. National said that they would be bringing back prescription fees, knowing it would lead to poor sick people not being able to get the medication that they need, and use the promise of cancer drugs as a way to make people stomach this bad policy. yet it seemed they had millions of more dollars to throw around to Firearm to keep their promise. Let's be clear, National did not want to fund these extra drugs. They just didn't want to be made fun of by the media for breaking their promise to voters.
National has apologised for its communication of this policy and should be probably asking some questions going forward as to whether or not it should ever promise specific drugs again.
I'm going to be sounding like a broken record in this video, but the billions of dollars in tax cuts that were given to landlords could have instead funded both of these policies, and have plenty of money left over. National yet again showing their priorities.
And the fact that they have chosen the wealth of some over the health of many, I think, is really, really sad.
Casey Costello is a relatively newcomer to New Zealand politics. She seemed to come out of nowhere and was elected as number 3 on New Zealand First list, and was made one of their 3 ministers. And who is she? Well, she's an outright plant of the smoking lobby. It's hard to see it any differently. Her position as Associate Health Minister and Minister in charge of Smoke Free 2025 is single-mindedly focused on anything that the tobacco companies seem to want. It was leaked that she was considering freezing the excise taxes on cigarettes, instead of increasing them every year as the law has been for years.
There's outrage over the Associate Health Minister's proposed freeze on excise tax for tobacco. Casey Costello is facing more questions over any influence from tobacco companies in government policy. She says she doesn't know who wrote a note asking for advice on freezing the tobacco excise tax, which was revealed in a piece by RNZ, with the opposition calling for her to be sacked.
She additionally scrapped Labour's world-leading tobacco policies that would have limited the sale of tobacco by a lot. And recently, she cut the tax on heated tobacco products, an alternative tobacco product that is seemingly the tobacco industry's way to astroturf as being healthier than cigarettes. She claims that she has secret expert advice that she has received that she won't share with the public or even the Prime Minister that shows that this decrease in tax would decrease smoking rates.
Told you that Philip Morris would be the biggest winner from the tax cuts for these heated tobacco products, and they also said that they would be toxic and more harmful than vaping. You have come back at that and said that you have independent advice that you've listened to. Can you say who that independent advice is from?
Yeah, and we've just covered that, so that'll be released. It's just there's been studies done, and there was advice from ASH, there was a range of pieces, and plus we know what's happened in Japan regarding heated tobacco. I think the important point there is that at no point did we say heated tobacco was safe. What we were saying was less harmful than smoking, and Health confirmed that it's less harmful than smoking. So what we're talking about is harm reduction products to send people on a pathway to quit smoking.
So to clarify, is it multiple bits of independent advice you received, and what sort of groups and people are we talking about here?
Yeah, so there's a study, and I'm thinking back to, so this will all be released. It's not an issue.
You're aware that smoke-free advocates say you should be concerned over the lack of transparency shown by the minister after documents reveal officials told Costello cutting the tax for heated tobacco products would benefit big tobacco companies like Philip Morris. And even Treasury officials warned the products are toxic and more harmful than vaping. I mean, Costello was claiming that she had evidence that showed independent advice before reducing the tax, but won't say where she got that from.
I disagree.
Can I just ask you, have you seen the evidence that Costello is talking about?
I haven't personally.
This is contrary to most independent cigarette studies.
Can she realistically claim to have truly independent advice given your studies that you have done, comprehensive studies, I should say?
Yeah, I have to say that I have. There's only one randomized controlled trial that I'm aware of that is not an industry-funded study as such that has shown some benefit of using heated tobacco products as a cessation tool. Virtually all the studies that we looked at that looked at the health impacts of heated tobacco products that are currently published are industry-based studies. So I think it's quite difficult to say that there's a strong evidence base that's independent from the industry that can support heated tobacco products. But I would like to stress, of course, that our study, as well as the Cochrane review that we undertook, does show reductions in harmful substances for people who use heated tobacco products. And so if you can't stop smoking with traditional smoking cessation support, including, say, varenicline, cytosine, or nicotine replacement therapy, and you haven't been able to stop smoking with e-cigarettes, then there may be a viable alternative. However, at this stage, I would say it's better to divert people to improve an existing treatment to help them stop smoking.
This is just par for the course for her party, as New Zealand First boss Winston Peters has constantly pushed for tobacco tax cuts for years. How Costello, a clear lobbyist working against the best interests of Kiwis, is able to keep her job is a mystery. The fact that Christopher Luxon hasn't put her out on her ass just shows how weak of a leader he is. Similarly to Costello, ACT Party Minister Nicole McKee seems to be a plant for the gun lobby.
The korowai that I wear today was presented to me by Kolfo. They have elected me the task of advocating on their behalf in the manner that I have conducted myself over recent times. The weight of their expectations rests upon me.
Yet this government seems it's fine to put her in charge of firearm laws as Associate Justice Minister. Her party, the ACT Party, was the only party to oppose the new firearm restrictions followed the March 15th mosque shooting terrorist attack, and supported repealing these regulations, that if implemented years ago would have made it impossible for the terrorists to possess those firearms. McKee was actually involved in giving advice to the last national government on gun laws, and did not support the needed changes to New Zealand firearm laws, no matter how much she tries to lie about it now.
Now, you might remember, before she was an MP, Nicole McKee was appointed by former Police Minister Paula Bennett to give independent advice on a select committee's report into illegal gun ownership in New Zealand. One of the things that was raised in that report was a loophole that meant anyone with the most basic gun licence could buy a semi-automatic firearm and separately buy a high-capacity magazine and instantly transform the gun into one that was supposed to be highly restricted.
When you talk about the 2017 inquiry, that was an inquiry into the illegal possession of firearms by criminals, and that particular loophole itself was something that we wanted to support and said needed to be tidied up.
When Q&A asked her about it, Nicole McKee was emphatic that she used that opportunity, directly advising the minister to try and close the loophole.
So you say that when you lobbied the minister at the time, that you argued to close that loophole?
Definitely.
But under the Official Information Act, Q&A has obtained a copy of the written advice submitted by Nicole McKee and another independent advisor. And not once in the 12-page, 4,000-word submission does it mention the loophole, even though it had been described by the Select Committee report as, quote, grounds for concern. Nicole McKee and her colleague told the minister to reject the committee's recommendation to look at reclassifying and potentially restricting semi-automatic firearms.
It's really disappointing, Jack, that we didn't have the opportunity to be able to seal that loophole up
well, you
between
did.
2017 and 2019.
You did, right?
Well, that's not me, though, Jack. I wasn't a minister at the time.
You advised the minister, though,
and
right?
I advised the minister that she should absolutely make sure that large capacity magazines are put on a licence, on an endorsed licence.
But again, despite what Nicole McKee said to us, in her official advice to the minister, nowhere did she recommend restrictions on high-capacity magazines, despite insisting in our interview that she advised the minister to close the March 15th loophole by restricting access to high-capacity magazines. Across the 16 pages that made up her submission and official independent advice, neither the legal loophole or restrictions on high-capacity magazines are mentioned. In summary, this is what we know. 7 years ago, an inquiry and subsequent Select Committee report specifically identified the loophole used by the Christchurch terrorist to build his weapons. When the report was released, Nicole McKee had a unique opportunity to directly, personally advise the minister in charge. She advised the minister to reject the committee's recommendation. And despite what she said in our interview and said again this week, in the official documents, there is no evidence she advised the minister to close the loophole or restrict high-capacity magazines. There's nothing in her official advice, nothing in her original submission, and the minister who appointed her doesn't recall the subject ever being brought up in conversation. It doesn't appear in the minister's notes or explicitly in the government's response. Why does this matter? Well, it matters because less than 2 years later, Brenton Tarrant used that loophole to build his weapons and kill 51 people.
McKee is planning on rewriting the firearm laws of New Zealand, and I have no faith that she'll be making New Zealand safer. If she is allowed to loosen the restrictions in New Zealand, the blood will be on her hands and the hands of this government, for allowing this lobbyist to dictate the firearm laws that the majority of Kiwis oppose changing. New Zealand First MP Shane Jones has some official ministerial title, but effectively he is the Minister of Destroying the Environment. He is bringing back oil and gas offshore mining, a ban that his party supported when his party was in coalition with the Labour Party.
Today, we are announcing that the coalition government has a plan to transition towards a carbon neutral future.
It's important that everyone realise that we are a government, although we have three parties involved, we have a common purpose, we have a common kaupapa. And the notion that we should not prepare for the inevitable disruptiveness that's going to afflict New Zealand as we fulfil our obligations and live up to our international credentials in respect of climate change is foolhardy. We must be prepared to stand up and lead the transition.
He is obsessed with investing in mineral mining around the country, wanting to double our mineral extraction, even pushing for extraction from Department of Conservation land. Now I understand that I'm a city boy. I've lived in Auckland my entire life, and it's hard for me to understand the plights of people who live in mining towns and rural areas, who desperately need support. But I don't believe that funding projects to further stuff over our beautiful country is the answer. Investment in other industries in other areas would be far better in my mind. Speaking of investment in regional areas, time to talk about what National used to call a slush fund, now called Policy of the Regional Growth Fund. This is a pet project of New Zealand First, in which extra funding that is separate from infrastructure funding will fund projects for pet projects of the coalition, and this budget will be under control of Minister Chris Bishop and Shane Jones. It's just funny that National can yell about tightening our belts and cutting funding for services, all while signing off on plans to spend billions of dollars that they called a slush fund.
There's a $1.2 billion capital funding commitment over the 3 years to regional infrastructure projects. And
is that a slush fund?
No, we'll be setting it up in a way that it's ministered well and diligently, and we're also setting
because
up...
Because I've got to raise this, because you called the Provincial Growth Fund when you said the PGF was Labour's reward to New Zealand First for supporting the coalition. The result is a slush fund that lacks transparency and is being treated by New Zealand First as a campaign chest for 2020. You also said the PGF is a giant waste of money. It's a great time to be a bureaucrat in Wellington, but if you're in the regions where jobs are needed, you're out of luck.
Well, there were definitely issues with the former Provincial Growth Fund, and I think Minister Jones would accept that as well. I don't want to speak for him, but I think he would accept that as well. We're interested in setting up a regional infrastructure fund, and actually one of the good things the Provincial Growth Fund did was spend capital money in the regions on projects that would perhaps otherwise have missed out on funding.
But you're telling us, just finally, you're telling us that it's not, that it's different somehow.
A big controversy of the last government was the Three Waters legislation. To dumb it down, the law was to take control of water assets from local control and give it to a centralised entity to manage. The state of water infrastructure is an absolute crisis in this country, especially in more rural areas of New Zealand. Decades of mismanagement from councils has led to the erosion of infrastructure, with many councils unable or unwilling to pay to fix it. The last government's plan was to pay these councils $1.2 billion for all of their water assets and would create a centralised plan to fix the issue nationwide. There was also stipulations that would discuss iwi consent and collaboration to be included. Now, almost every mayor was against the taking of these assets from the councils. This included many councils that actually invested good money into their water infrastructure. This was also opposed by racists, as you could imagine, or even just people skeptical of iwi inclusion in the law. The National Party was against it, obviously, which made it very controversial, and became a bit of a culture war for a bit, even though really it was a pretty boring infrastructure project that shouldn't really have got the level of buzz that it did. Now, because of the controversy, the government dragged its heels in implementing it, and now that we have a new government, the National Party has scrapped this legislation. Now, the government doesn't get that money back, so it was a good payday for councils, and National doesn't really have a great plan on how to fix the issue. They are essentially saying that they're going to mandate councils invest properly in this infrastructure, but without extra funding, we're sort of at the same position.
Are you going to put any money into this at all?
Well, ultimately, it's about providing the tools for councils to be able to make those investments over the long term.
Setting aside the tools, money. Any money?
Well, there's some money in terms of better off funding that the last government had set aside for councils in terms of some of the transitionary work.
So that's existing money. Is this new government putting new money in?
Central government will play a key role.
What role?
Well, firstly, we're going to require them to put in place a water service delivery plan. We will have a regulatory backstop if they don't deliver that. We will have step-in powers to ensure that those councils do undertake that plan. And we will also make sure that councils are working together so that no council is left behind. But ultimately, at the same time, we're going to respect the important role that local councils have in delivering local infrastructure, something we criticised the last government for not doing and which and voters rejected.
What they don't say explicitly is, of course, that means the costs are landing on the council. How much costs? Well, somewhere between 125 and 185 billion over 30 years. It's an extraordinary sum of money. The minister says it's less than that. The industry says it may even be higher. So let's say somewhere in the ballpark of $4 to $6 billion a year, and I think at the upper end. How do councils pay for that? Because they will be required to. So there is debt, of course. Some councils are kind of
maxed out, aren't they?
Yeah, they're maxed out to the nth degree. So so there's debt, there's increased rates, but and there will be many people watching tonight who say they can't increase our rates anymore.
Additionally, it's pretty rich that they campaigned against Three Waters as an argument to keep big government out of local issues, yet their apparent plan is to mandate councils on how to manage their assets. Mark my words, this government will not solve this issue, and water infrastructure is going to be a massive issue in the years to come, because past governments and this government is too blind or incompetent to fix the problem. And so while we're talking about Simeon Brown, he's also the Transport Minister. I think transport and infrastructure policy are pretty nitty-gritty and hard to discuss, but briefly, the government is ramping up large road construction and underfunding public transport. You know, run-of-the-mill national stuff. The National Party won't be satisfied until they pave the entire country and it's turned into a 1,000-lane highway. Law and order was a big issue at the election. The media sensation of ram raids was in the news constantly prior to the election. Now National still cares about cracking down on crime. And what was on the agenda? Bringing back a 3 strikes law, essentially saying that if it is an offender's third offence, the court must sentence them to a higher sentence.
It's the scheme where criminals who commit serious, violent and sexual offences are progressively given harsher sentences. On the third strike, they get the maximum penalty.
This is a dumb law. I believe that obviously a judge should consider criminal history when sentencing a criminal, but such a blanket rule is stupid. You can see this play out overseas.
And those who commit repeated violent crimes should be told, when you commit a third violent crime, you will be put away and put away for good. 3 strikes and you are out.
3 strikes laws have succeeded in locking up thousands without any substantial drop in the crime rate.
Yeah, the problem with these laws is that it's a one-size-fits-all policy, and the reason we have judges is to determine individual circumstances. No 2 crimes, no 2 offenders are exactly alike.
And judges find their hands tied under 3 strikes laws. They have no freedom to consider the circumstances of the crime or the defendant.
Judges saying that they don't wish to give such a large sentence, but their hands are tied, and they must hand out the sentence regardless of the situation. Our system is designed so judges can take the circumstances into account and make the best decision available, not just one size fits all, where the punishment for all murders or whatever get the same length of sentence. The last Labour government got rid of this law and the national government is bringing it right back. This better be gone day one of the new government because it is unfair and it's a dumb law.
Chris Hipkins says he's opposed to the reintroduction of the 3 strikes, but can't say if Labour will repeal the new scheme.
We'll set out our policy on that before the election.
Housing policy is a very important topic, and we're really yet to see movement on policy in this front. We're still waiting to see what the replacement for the Resource Management Act will be, and how many regulations this government is planning on cutting to improve building speeds. Now, a scandal involving the Housing Minister Christopher Bishop was that he hired the former Prime Minister Bill English to head a review of Kāinga Ora, the organisation that owns and operates state houses.
News Hub can reveal Sir Bill English was signed on to head a $500,000 review of Kāinga Ora through a couple of simple text messages with the minister.
And News Hub can reveal how the former PM came to head the $500,000 probe we've obtained the text exchange. The first contact is direct from Sir Bill. Chris, will there be a review of KO? Bishop replies, we're going to do an independent review into finances, performance, cost, etc. Commence at ASAP, hopefully get terms of reference and reviews sorted before Christmas. Sir Bill said, I could help with that. The response from Bishop, excellent. Let's do that. A day after Bishop gave the green light, Sir Bill issued some terms of his own. I will help if it's a short, sharp review, no public submissions or field trips. Bishop agrees, saying definitely not. 3 people, you and 2 others. He goes on to say no involvement from KO. Independent. To reiterate, the Housing Minister saying there would be no involvement from Kāinga Ora in the review of Kāinga Ora.
This review seemed to have been a way to give some of National's mates a quick buck, while doing a rushed review that gave a seemingly predetermined outcome, without even consulting anyone who works for KO.
And everything suggests that this was a stitch-up and that the outcomes were predetermined.
In a letter to Sir Bill ahead of the release of his final report, the acting chair of Kāinga Ora's board said there was relatively limited engagement with our organisation, leading to some review conclusions appearing to be based on analysis informed by anecdotes.
How on earth can you review an organisation without actually talking to the organisation?
But I'm sorry, but if Bill English was such an expert in KO operations, the government that him and John Key ran wouldn't have seriously underfunded it for years. In April, there was a shock announcement from Warner Brothers Discovery. They are the corporate owners of Newshub, one of New Zealand's major news broadcasters, and one of the 2 Kiwi channels that ran a 6 PM news show. It was announced that Newshub would be closed, 300 jobs would be lost, and more specifically, TV3 News would stop being produced and broadcasted. New Zealand is a small market, and journalism already isn't very competitive or profitable. The only other 6 PM news show was One News, a government-owned entity owned and operated by TVNZ. Now, journalism has been on the ropes for a while, with the last government shelling out $55 million to support the struggling journalism industry. Now, the news of the closure of Newshub was a shock to everyone, but the Minister of Broadcasting seemed completely caught off guard. It seemed to be inexperienced and didn't seem to care about the issue.
Warner Brothers Discovery has never actually reached out for assistance. It's not something that they felt that was helpful. I don't think there's anything that we could have actually done to actually assist them.
Newshub can reveal Warner Brothers Discovery does not agree with the Minister's version of events.
Yeah, absolutely not true. So there are 2 parts to that statement. The first part around there was nothing that could happen. We were specifically talking about cordia relief. We were talking about the proposed Google-Facebook Digital Bargaining Act. And my comments to her were that neither of those things are in place right now, and neither of them would address the scale of the revenue drop that we've had in the market that we talked about today.
It feels like the government will not be riding to the rescue.
No, I think Christopher Luxon and Melissa Lee's response today, very poor. They are losing an iconic news service here, and they just don't seem to realise that. And for Melissa Lee to say, oh, there's Sky. OK, so what? Sky are going to go and start a full service news? That's not going to happen. That's just crazy.
This led the former Labour Broadcasting Minister to publicly call her stupid for her inaction.
Yesterday you called Melissa Lee, the Broadcasting Minister, or Media and Information Minister, whatever her title is, you called her stupid. Is that appropriate?
No, probably not. Probably a better description would be hopeless, useless, incompetent. I think those are probably better descriptions, Lloyd, rather than using...
Takes one boot up.
Yeah, I think so. So I think hopeless, useless, incompetent, like your government in terms of what's happening here. Can I just wish you all the best? I really... was saddened. I was saddened because I was thinking, you try and find a way. You know, you don't just say, oh, I just give up. And she showed, it's not just Melissa's fault. It's this government's fault. They have made broadcasting no priority. It's not part of the plan. They don't see this place as iconic, which I do. There's such a background, such a history here. I think about the Māori broadcasters who've come out of here, Julian and Mihi and Annabelle, you know, Native Affairs, and the government just does not see it as a priority in terms of what
can they do? I mean,
so I'll tell you what they can do. You got a Prime Minister who prides himself on business. Why don't you try and bring big business together? Why don't you try and look at opportunities with New Zealand On Air? Why don't we just try and keep this alive for a while? You know, I like the spirit of Paddy Gower and the way he's, you know, of course you can't just put straight investment in, but if you're the big businessman, as the Prime Minister says he is, try and pull something together. Look at ways of finding relief, of keeping you guys alive. It's tragic what's happened here. It's tragic because we need alternatives. We need plurality of voices. And that's why my heart goes out to you guys. You know, you guys have done a great job.
The government was faced with a massive change, with one of the biggest players in news closing down, and it seemed like they didn't even try to save it, or even have a plan about the future. Melissa Lee was fired from cabinet for her incompetence.
In Christopher Luxon's surprise reshuffle, Melissa Lee is out, stripped of her broadcasting portfolio, as the media industry faces huge financial challenges. She's also been axed from cabinet.
Melissa Lee and Penny Simmons stripped from key portfolios.
What this is about is me sitting as Prime Minister, looking across my team and saying, have I got the right people on the right assignments at this point in time? And my assessment is, in both these cases, on disability and on media and communications, I want to make a change.
And it stands to reason to question how she even got to number 13 on National's list, and how Christopher Luxon can even keep her around as a minister outside of cabinet at all. There was a makeshift deal formulated by the news company Stuff, who will support Newshub to continue making 6pm news. The government doesn't seem interested in helping the journalism industry. It doesn't seem to care about their troubles, and when further problems arise, they seem ill-equipped to handle them. As part of the coalition deal, the ACT Party wanted Section 7AA of the Oranga Tamariki Act, or the Children's and Young People's Wellbeing Act, repealed. This seemed very niche and specific, but it could have massive ramifications. To give a very brief and dumbed down explanation, Oranga Tamariki has the authority to remove a child from an unsafe home and rehome the child in a safe household. This power can be used for many reasons, but mainly for ongoing abuse, where the ministry concludes that the child is unsafe. Now, Section 7AA essentially states that the ministry needs to take the Treaty of Waitangi into consideration when conducting their business when it involves Māori children. New Zealand has a tragic history of the erosion of the Māori culture and language, people in living memory being affected by the colonial laws that discourage Māori culture.
Much te reo around then?
Kaore. Not really. My grandma didn't speak Māori. She was of the generation that would be punished at school if she's, that was her first language, but, they get hit if they spoke.
I know that's what happened to my dad too. Sucked, eh?
Yeah.
Additionally, the history of closed adoption in New Zealand has led to thousands of Māori being adopted into Pākehā families with all the connection to their culture severed. Now, Section 7AA of the Act seemingly designed to make sure that we do not continue this erosion of the culture and to keep children connected with their culture, even when the state has to intervene in an abusive household. Now, the Minister for Children, Karen Shaw, argues that this part of the legislation has led to further abuse and even death, with children being sent back to abusive households.
We've seen some public cases, but also as I've travelled around the country and also before becoming an MP, I spoke about some of those circumstances, seeing young people actually being sent back to their abusers for visitation because connection was seen as so important. And seeing that trauma on those young people and they're knowing they're being sent back to the very people who hurt them, all for a connection, that's not in a child's best interest, and that's traumatic.
People would agree.
Shouldn't be happening.
Yeah, people would agree with that, but my question was, what empirical evidence do you have that 7AA is leading to bad outcomes?
Yep, and then we've got the court cases, the very public court cases. Moana was one, where she was removed from a very loving, safe environment, all based on race. Those decisions were based on sending her back into her culture, when actually the decision had been made that that was her forever home.
There is a lot of finger-pointing regarding these public tragedies of the failures of Oranga Tamariki. However, is the removal of this section of the law necessary? I'm no lawyer, but it seems that Section 7AA states that culture should be taken into consideration, but should not be the most important factor. The child's safety is the most important factor.
Section 4A is very clear that actually the best interests of the child or young person are the first, and here's the important word, paramount consideration. So that would suggest that anything else in the Act actually comes second to this line. The children's best interests have to come first.
Surely the Minister for Children should be looking at how her ministry is operated, opposed to a niche section of the legislation. If there are operational issues in Oranga Tamariki that allows bad decision making, and is not putting children's safety above everything else, shouldn't the minister in charge be focused on this and not niche legislative changes that seemingly wouldn't even target the problems?
So in the regulatory impact statement regarding this repeal, Page 9 says this, quote, "There is no empirical evidence to support the notion that Section 7AA has driven practice decisions that have led to changing care environments." We've heard anecdotal concerns from a small number of caregivers that care decisions are more strongly influenced by cultural factors. That's like what you've described to us this morning. But then it says this, "Departmental evidence demonstrates the problem more likely stems from flaws in the practice of individual staff."
It seems to me that the repeal of this section would only lead to similar outcomes as closed adoptions, with more and more children being separated from their ancestry and their culture. And it's hard to take the government at their word for it, that this is specifically about the safety of children, when you look at their other Māori-orientated policies, and how they wish to strip the mention of the treaty from other legislations, how Chaw's boss wants to have a referendum on the treaty principles, and the gutting of other Māori-orientated policies. When it looks like anti-Māori policies and quacks like it too, it's hard for me to believe that it's anything different. Now, I find Minister Karen Shaw to be quite sincere when she conducts herself. She was brought up in the adoption system and seems to be passionate about reforming it for the safety of children. I respect this. I am devastated by the stories that you hear about victims of abuse, and I hope to hell that this minister can focus on the reforms needed to support these fragile members of our community. But I believe that the action that she is taking will harm Māori in this country, and if this is not corrected, we will see more Māori severed from their culture. I feel this is a good time to stop. There are plenty of other things that we could discuss. Pseudoephedrine being brought back to pharmacies, the scrapping of investment in ferry infrastructure, policies that have been brought in to cut down on absences in schools, boot camps being brought in for youth offenders, and thousands of public servants being sacked. But I think we've had a good discussion on a variety of stories of what this government has to offer. I think I've been pretty upfront with my biases. I don't like this government, I didn't vote for them, and I most likely will not be voting for them in the next election. But look what I have listed. Massive handouts to the wealthy, horrible charter school policies being brought back, ministers completely running amok with their incompetence and shady priorities, and anti-Māori sentiment being the norm. How could anyone argue that this government has its priorities in order? Now, to be fair, what are the alternatives? The Labour Party, who flip-flops in their policies, who still has an ineffectual leader, who turned a record-breaking landslide victory in 2020 to an embarrassing defeat in 2023. The Green Party, who have been drenched in scandal, whose MPs are either leaving the party or retiring or going to jail. And to Party Māori, who definitely don't even try to act like they represent all of New Zealand, only representing the Māori community. Is this an alternate government waiting in the wings? It doesn't look like it. But if we're going to grade Prime Minister Christopher Luxon's report card, it's definitely a D. He is certainly not at a passing grade, but you know, it could be way worse. The cuts could be deeper, they could be giving more handouts to the wealthy, they could be passing more outrageous free market policies that David Seymour has wet dreams about, but this is hardly a good government. Stay in the loop by following this channel, and you know, maybe I'll make more videos about what this government is up to.